Welcome to the Why on Earth Community Podcast. I'm your host, Aaron William Perry, and today we're visiting with Ben Raskin, the author of the Woodchip Handbook, a complete guide for farmers, gardeners, and landscapers. Hey Ben, how you doing?
Hi, Aaron. It's great to be here.
Yeah, so excited to chat with you today about one of my very favorite topics, which is soil building and mulching and so on. And you've got a whole lot of very specific and practical knowledge to share with us today. So I'm really happy we can have this chat together.
Yeah, well, Woodchip is one of those things. When I started writing it, people went, "Oh, that's a bit niche, isn't it?" And then when you start talking to people, they go, "Oh, no, I love it. I love it. I'm so pleased there's a book on it." So it sort of seems a bit specialist, but actually, so many people I think are interested in it. It's been great. So.
Yeah, absolutely fabulous. I can see why after reading it. Ben Raskin has worked in horticulture for more than 25 years and has a wide range of experience in both practical commercial growing and wider policy and advocacy work. As head of horticulture and agroforestry for the Soil Association, he provides growers at all levels of production with technical, marketing, policy, supply chain, and networking support. He is currently implementing a 200-acre silvopastoral agroforestry planting in Wiltshire, England. Ben is the author of several previous books on gardening, including Zero Waste Gardening and the Community Gardening Handbook, as well as 3 volumes of the Grow Together guides aimed at families with young children, compost, grow, and bees, bugs, and butterflies. Additionally, Ben co-chairs the DEFRA Edibles Horticulture Roundtable and sits on the board of the Organic Growers Alliance and Community Supported Agriculture Network UK. So Ben, I love that you write books for both adults and children, as do I, as we discussed, and we'll chat about that in a few minutes. But before getting into those topics, let us know. Tell us. Why wood chips? Why does this matter? What's the big deal?
So I guess I mean, like a lot of people, I'd used wood chip for mulching paths. I think, and it's kind of quite common, and it's really good for that purpose. And I'd used it a bit for mulching some plants, but I hadn't really thought about it beyond that. And over the last 5 or 6 years, really, partly because of the work we've been doing with the tree planting on the farm. And partly because some of the trials I've been involved with through the work we do with the Soil Association and the Innovative Farmers Program that we run there, I can talk more about. Just a number of things just kept on popping out. It was like, oh, woodchip can do that, and woodchip can do that. And I suddenly thought, there's a bit more to it than just sticking it on the paths and stopping your boots getting muddy, really. So it was a sort of drip, I guess, in a way. And then there was one big eureka moment, which maybe we'll come on to later. So I'll leave that hanging maybe as sort of as a trailer. But yeah,
I like it. Yeah, leave a little hook there for the audience. That's great. Well, reading through the book, which of course is published by Chelsea Green Publishing, one of our partners at the Why on Earth community, and I'll just real quick mention that if you'd like to get Ben's book, you can use the code YOE35 for a 35% discount at Chelsea Green, and we'll be sure to share some of the links and other resources a little later on. But as I was reading through this, Ben, I was struck by the level of detail, the comprehensiveness of the book, including some of the science and more technical aspects. But it's laid out and organized and articulated in such a clear, straightforward, accessible way. It seemed to me that this would be a valuable resource for just about any gardener, farmer, landscaper, as we mentioned in the subtitle. And you've included a lot of really valuable information, ranging from overall uses and benefits to what's going on with nitrogen fixing and even getting into growing mushrooms and so on. And I'm excited we can work our way through some of these topics. But before getting off course a little from the main points here, could you just tell us what are the overall uses and benefits of wood chips? Why should folks consider expanding their use of wood chips in their gardens and farms?
So I think not to move away from mulches, because mulches aren't great, and it's still the easiest way, I think, to make use of wood chips. And not just for weed control, but for moisture retention, temperature modulation, pest and disease control. There's a whole range of quite unexplored benefits when you're using it. You think it's just keeping the weeds down, but it's actually doing quite a lot of other stuff. But then much more than that, I'm interested in the long-term effect on soil health from it. And one of the a lot of the science that I used in the book, some of it came from David Granatstein, who you may already have come across, who's done a lot of work with commercial orchards in the States. And he sort of shows the benefits to the tree and to tree health and to yield from using organic mulches and wood chip mulches as opposed to plastic or herbicide weed control. So that was quite powerful. I'm quite steeped in the commercial world, although, as you say, these principles are applicable to anyone. So seeing that commercial benefit made my ears prick up in a way and go, okay, well, so it is quite expensive to put this stuff down commercially, but you get the benefit back. So if commercial people are doing it, then there's absolutely no reason why, if you're doing it in your garden, there's no barrier in a way, apart from getting hold of the stuff. And then there's a few other things. So there's one grower that I quote quite a lot in the book, Ian Tolhurst, or Tolly as he's known, who's a very long-standing vegan organic grower here in the UK, who's been using wood chip for, I think, 10 plus years, and he's mostly been composting it and spreading it onto his soil as a soil health booster. And he's, his soil is just incredible, and it's not the greatest soil. It's not typical vegetable growing land. What he always says, I've got some good soil, it's just you've got to find it in amongst the rocks. It's that kind of so we have this sort of soil classification system here in the UK. So you have grade 1, which is the best, which is really good horticultural land, and then it goes down to 2, and then 3A and 3B, and I think he's 3B. But he said since he started using wood chip on his soil, he's seen his productivity just shoot through the roof and his soil health shoot through the roof. And he's done, he's had worm counts done on his farm, and he's got millions of worms per hectare, tons of them under there. And I remember going one time to see him, and he just spread the wood chip a couple of weeks earlier, and we were looking down at the soil floor, and literally every bit of soil you could see was a worm cast. It was astonishing. I've never seen this sort of heaving kind of active mass of soil under your feet. It was extraordinary. So sort of things like that, it just, you go, oh, okay, there's definitely more than just mulch. And then he also makes his own propagation compost from wood chip. And then there's another grower, Fred Bonistrew, who used to grow for the Prince of Wales, but now runs his own business. And he makes these hotbeds out of wood chips, so harnessing the heat as they rot down to use for propagation in the spring. So yeah, loads of stuff other than just mulch. Although I hesitate to say just mulch because it's pretty powerful.
I imagine most of our audience know what worm castings are, but just in case some might not, just mention these are the excretions of the worms as they're moving their way through the soil as detritivores, right? They're eating a lot of the decomposing organic matter. And I understand that their castings have something like 106 beneficial enzymes, and those worms are providing so much bioavailable benefit to the biology of the soil. Is that your understanding, Ben?
Absolutely. And as well as that, they produce this kind of sticky mucus, and that's really beneficial for helping to create this aggregation of soils. They're helping it sort of clump together, and that gives the soil resilience. So if you get really heavy rain, which we are increasingly getting now with climate change, the structure won't be destroyed. And if it's really hot and dry, it's going to hang on to the moisture that's in it more easily because it's got these clumps of organic matter full soil. So you definitely want worms. I mean, I know they're not native, are they? I think, or some of them aren't native in the States, but they are here. But it's certainly we see them as beneficial. So they're an indicator of soil health, certainly. So.
Well, certainly the farmers and growers I'm connected to throughout North America and elsewhere all seem to agree that worms are very good to have around. So
Yeah.
I think it's a general consensus as far as I can tell.
Yeah.
Just hanging on the mulch topic here, I want to make sure we're making one distinction that you make in the book, which is avoiding the artificially colored wood chip mulches. Can you tell us a bit about this and why that's not necessarily what we're looking for?
Yeah, so it's you've got to be careful. I think what I'm looking at is chopped up trees. That's what I want. I don't want anything else in there. So I don't want old pallets, which might have goodness knows what. And I definitely don't want any old painted doors or So there's a lot of recycled wood that is sometimes called wood chip, and you've got to be pretty careful not to get that on. The coloured ones. I mean, I actually instinctively I don't like them very much anyway. I think they look a bit odd. Actually, when I looked into the potential harm from them, it's not quite as bad as I thought it was going to be. I think historically there was probably some quite nasty chemicals in them. I think now they tend to be. I think the regulations sort of mean that you've got to have fairly benign dyes. But I just don't quite see the point. You just want chopped up bits of tree, really. So yeah, I would avoid any. And besides which, you're effectively paying, someone to have made it a pretty color when you don't need them to. So it's going to be an expensive way of buying it anyway. So.
Yeah, and speaking about sourcing, you go into some detail around sourcing strategies that, of course, will vary depending on our location and our purpose, our intent, our scale, and so on. Can you give us a bit of an overview of what you've discussed there in terms of sourcing?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, you can obviously, even on a very small scale, you can make your own wood chip. And what I've started doing, and I think this is almost kind of like the syntropic agroforestry thing, where you're sort of pulling everything down into the soil. So when I prune a bush now in my garden, I've only got a little garden, but I chop it up with a pair of secateurs and just spread it on the soil. So rather than take it away and either burn it or send it off to local composting facility, I'm just putting it back into the soil. So you can do it even on a very small scale, but obviously that takes quite time. You can hire little mulchers, little chippers and mulchers in to deal. If you've got a bit more wood than you can deal with by hand. Again, it's quite a lot of effort for a relatively small amount of wood chip, I would say, generally. But possibly still better than getting rid of it and losing that resource from the land. Once you get up to a slightly bigger scale, or if you're taking a really big tree down, then it's definitely worth hiring in a bigger wood chipper, a machine that will just plow through it. Because otherwise you're there for hours kind of feeding these little branches into the chipper, which can take a lot of time. Whereas the big ones, they're relatively cheap to hire in, depending on where you are. Again, there's certainly, if you're a bit more isolated, then actually you can't necessarily get hold of this machinery. So that's an issue. We had an associate up in Scotland, actually, there's a picture of his raised beds in the book, and there's just no one within 150 miles that hires wood chippers. So he had to buy one because there was just no option. But generally, if you're near an urban centre, you should be able to get them. And then if you've got more land, if you've got your own small holding or farm, or then you can start to grow your own, and that's, to me, where it kind of hits the sweet spot. You can get the benefits of having those trees and that short rotation coppice particularly. So you get the biodiversity benefit, potentially windbreak benefits and all of that, browse if you've got livestock, and then you get this great resource when you manage it.
Yeah, we're even hearing about some communities here in North America that are pooling together, often with a local nonprofit, to have the wood chipper resource and a trained crew to manage it, that can go to different yards and neighborhoods when folks have need and opportunity to chip up wood. So we're actually working on a resource currently that will be out hopefully sometime in the next year or so, that is focused on neighborhood scale stewardship, regeneration, and sustainability efforts, and helping move the needle in that direction. So we'll be sure to include wood chipping as part of this resource.
Yeah.
And
You can.
yeah, maybe,
There are, I think, as well. There's websites where you can sort of register yourself to receive free chip as well. And I
oh
think
yeah,
particularly in the States, I think there's some of the power companies, when they clear the trees from the lines, will sort of redistribute some of that chip to local, customers or neighborhoods. So there are opportunities to get hold of free chip in some quantity. And certainly that's what we do. The farm where I work, we have two arborists who in the UK you have to pay to get rid of your wood chip. So for them to be able to give it to us, one of them particularly is, we're a mile away, lives on his way home, so he can just drive in. We've got a concrete pad, he can drop it off. It's simple, and it sort of works for both of us. So but yeah, I have heard in some parts of the UK now you can't get hold of it free. You have to pay them to drop it. So I think it's getting scarce in some parts. But
yeah, the old supply and demand, huh?
exactly. But okay, it's a shame you can't get it free, but it's great that it's being valued and not just kind of dumped. So because there was a time when it was ending up in landfill, which is just crazy. So
Yeah, no doubt. That's doubly, if not triply, negative impact, right? One of the things we love to share with people and make sure our audience knows about this today is that when we send our organic quote unquote wastes to landfill, often they go into anaerobic decomposition, which produces a lot of methane that leaks up into the atmosphere, exacerbating the energy heat trapping attributes of the atmosphere. So whenever we can, with any of our plant derived, whether it's used paper towels or kitchen scraps or wood chips, leaves in the yard, whenever we can compost those instead or apply them to the landscape, it's a much better situation overall.
yeah, absolutely.
So what about when folks are sourcing chips from commercial suppliers and or are buying them? What's the best way for people to get the quality they're expecting and make sure there aren't contaminants and these aren't recycled wood products that might have paints or whatever on them?
Yeah, I mean, it can be tricky. I mean, the best way obviously is to know who's producing it. And again, we're lucky. We've got these two guys, and we can look at the van when it comes in, and they know the sort of stuff we want. Although we occasionally get chainsaw helmet left in it, or which is interesting. But yeah, generally the quality is great. And I think you can see if you look at it, particularly if it's not composted already, you can see whether it's got anything undesirable in that. You want nice clean bits of what looks like recognizable tree. But ask the retailer, ask who it is you're getting from, and if it's a arborist dropping some chip and you don't like the look of it, then send it back, because you don't want, if it's not useful to you, then it's free is not always good, is it, if it's not something you want. So but normally, I think normally if you look at it, you can see it. Once it's composted, it gets a bit trickier, because everything sort of breaks down a bit and looks brown, and unless you're looking at a microscope, you can't always tell what's in it. And again, we have that a bit of a problem with some of our green compost, or green waste compost, they're sometimes called, the municipal ones, which end up having quite a lot of glass and plastic contaminants in them. But you can't see it if you look at it often. So one of the things I like about wood chip is it's much less likely to have some of those in, because it tends to just come from trees.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And you had just mentioned a few moments ago about, for those who are able to grow your own, and you mentioned a number of short rotation coppice species that are really useful, including willow, poplar, hazel, chestnut, etc. Can you describe for us why those particular trees have such a beneficial value in this kind of a wood chip system?
So I'll maybe come on to willow in a minute, but generally I think there's not very much research has been done on single species chip, and I think there's potentially just so much that we could get from that, because each tree will have a particular chemical makeup that might benefit our system in a particular way. but most of that research hasn't been done. And then within that, you know, different trees, you know, some trees are hard. You know, willow obviously goes really quickly, but breaks down quite quickly. In one of our trials, one of the growers used a hornbeam mulch, which was really hard and lasted 3 times the amount. So, you know, you go, okay, well, I'm going to get less chip per plant per year, but if I've only got to apply it once instead of having to apply it 3 times, then it might still be worth it. So sort of understanding the you know, the different properties of different woods is really helpful. But the willow is particularly interesting, and we did one of these innovative farmers field labs that I mentioned looking at willow. So there's a scientist called Glyn Percival who works a lot with urban trees, and he was doing a trial using single species wood chip, and he noticed that the apple tree that he put the willow chip around seemed to have less apple scab disease than the ones that didn't have willow, and he thought that's quite interesting. And the theory is basically that the salicylic acid, you know, the aspirin that's in willow, seems to stimulate an immune reaction in the tree that makes it better able to fight off disease. So we wanted to test that with some commercial alcoholic cider producers here in the southwest. And we did, I think we had 5 or 6 growers, I think, involved in the trial. And the trial showed a trend towards effectiveness. We didn't prove it. Mainly, he thinks because they were all a bit scared of putting enough mulch on, because they harvest mechanically and they didn't want the chip getting caught up in the machine. So they didn't put as much chip down as he'd hoped they would. But there was still a trend towards this reduction in disease. And in theory, that, you know, that should work on almost any disease. It's creating effectively a more robust, healthy tree. So there's stuff like that that is, you know, not explored very much, but I think it has huge potential.
Very interesting. You know, we do a lot of work in the biodynamic community worldwide, and actually have one of our social enterprise products is called Soilworks, a biodynamic preparation blend we offer for sale, and actually can offer discounts through the podcast here. And I know that in the wine growing regions of California, for example, they're using a lot of biodynamics on both organic and conventional vineyards, because it's been one of the only things that's helpful with the blight that folks out in California have been dealing with for many years. And I'm curious, are you seeing vintners using wood chip as well on their vineyards? Is that something that is being done now at a substantial scale?
Not many. There's 1 or 2 growers that I've been talking to that have started experimenting. It is difficult on a commercial scale, because it is costly. I mean, the material itself is not always that expensive, but spreading it, and particularly, you know, somewhere like a vineyard, you've got a lot of rows of a lot of small plants, you know, so it's slightly different where you've got big trees and not so many of them. But it's, you know, even if you think it's great, and even if it's having a difference, just getting the material and spreading it is a big cost. So this, you know, again, this is why I think if you can start to produce your own and have it on site, and then you're sort of cutting out some of that transport cost, which is the big issue really for a lot of it. The material is usually free or cheap, but the cost of transporting it and spreading it is the barrier. But yeah, it would be interesting to see how much effect it has on some of those vineyard diseases.
Yeah, very interesting. And getting back to the point about harder woods generally breaking down more slowly, is it essentially kind of a 1-to-1 correlation in terms of the faster, softer woods and the slower growing harder woods, in terms of how long that wood chip lasts in contact with the soil?
I mean, instinctively, yes. I haven't seen studies actually looking at breakdown rates, and I think it depends a little bit on probably climate. You know, so things probably break down quicker here where we're a bit warm and wet. You know, whereas if you're really dry, they're just getting hot and dry. They're just going to sit there probably. So I suspect there's that. There's yeah, I don't know as a shot. So I just know from looking at stuff and using it, that there are definitely, you know, harder wood takes longer to break down, bigger lumps take longer to break down, you know, so So you know, I quite often get asked, well, what's the best chip to use, or how big do I want it? And I go, well, it depends what you want to use it for, you know, because it's not big or small, is not good or bad. You know, if you want to mulch a tree, then you probably want big, fresh chip, because it's not, you know, the roots are deep down, it's not going to rob nitrogen, or, you know, it will rob nitrogen just from the sort of 1 or 2 centimeters that it touches of the soil. So for a tree, you know, the roots are deep down, that's fine. But if you're starting to mulch, you know, something like raspberries or shallow rooted vegetables, and you put fresh wood on the surface, it's going to probably cause some problems. So then you might want either a very small chip, or you might want to compost it first, you know. So sort of understanding, I guess, what you need from the material will help to sort of get it in the right condition.
Great. Yeah, I want to ask you a bit about the nitrogen piece in just a moment, but this makes me think I'm out here at Elk Run Farm, and in the gardens we've got wood chips down in the walk paths, and not only is this a wonderful way to keep the walkways covered and not so muddy when there's rain, but it's also delightful to walk on barefoot, and this is a use that I imagine you might advocate for folks in all kinds of different climate situations.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, what I know a lot of people do is then at the end of the season, they'll effectively scrape up the slightly composted chip from the path and put it onto the bed or the soil, and then put fresh wood chip down on the path. So effectively they're sort of starting that cycle of breaking stuff down already by using it as a, you know, on the walkways. So.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, and in the book, the Woodchip Handbook, you're also talking about strategies around nitrogen specifically and nitrogen fixers. Can you walk us through that, what you advise there?
So yeah, and again, this sort of, for me, a lot of this comes into holistic farm planning. So, you know, one of the things I think that's held woodchip back a little bit over the years is the reputation it has for locking up nitrogen. And everyone goes, oh, don't put woodchip on the soil, it's going to lock up nitrogen. And you know, as I said, you can do that, and you can do it really badly if you get it wrong. But actually, the risk generally, I think, is pretty low. And I think the problems come either when you use it for shallow rooted plants, as I mentioned earlier, or if you dig in fresh wood chip. That's when you really get problems. So where I mentioned before, what seems to happen. So when wood starts to break down, it's the fungi that are breaking it down. So bacteria can't really start that process. They're not strong enough to get through the complex lignins in the wood chip. So it's the fungi that starts it. And they actually have a relatively low nitrogen need compared to bacteria. But they do need some. They need a bit of nitrogen to work and function. And if there's no nitrogen in the chip, and again, the amount of nitrogen will depend on the age of the wood that the chip's made from. And we may come on to ramiel wood chip, this kind of younger wood chip. But effectively, you know, if there's a lot of bits of leaf and young bark in the chip, it will have more nitrogen and therefore less likely to lock up nitrogen. If it's from a big old tree, you know, you imagine that whole trunk is just carbon, basically. There's not much else. And to break that down is going to need some nitrogen. So what happens if you just spread it on the surface is the bits, the fungi are there kind of looking for nitrogen. There's a bit that comes down in the rain, but mostly not very much. They're going to go off looking for it and scavenging it. And they're going to hit the soil and they go, oh, there's a bit of nitrogen here in this top layer of soil. So they kind of grab that and use that to start breaking down the wood chip that's touching it. As far as I can see, they don't go much deeper than that. So if you just lay it on the surface, you're not going to get a problem most of the time. If you then dig it in, every bit of wood chip is then surrounded by soil, and it's going to suck nitrogen from every bit that it's touching. So if you dig it down to a foot, you're locking up nitrogen in that top foot of soil. So that's why you really don't want to dig in. I mean, I tend not to dig in even composted wood chip. I tend to put it on top and let, you know, the worms and other things pull it down. But definitely with fresh wood chip, you want to keep it on the surface. But obviously, it's a temporary, it's a cycle. So it'll suck that nitrogen up to start with, but as the wood chip breaks down, it releases it back into the soil, and then it's absorbed. And because you've boosted worm populations, fungi populations, all of this stuff. It's locked up, and so you've got this reservoir of nitrogen, but actually a whole load of other nutrients. And if you then, particularly if you start producing your own, and maybe using something like alder, which is nitrogen fixing anyway, so you're then effectively pulling nitrogen out. You're getting some nitrogen anyway from the tree. You're then chipping what is, on a short rotation crop, is quite a high nitrogen wood chip relatively. So then you're kind of really starting to build fertility. And I'm really interested in how we use those sort of more permanent type of crops for building fertility. We've had a tendency to go, we've got to have animals to do it, and you've got to have lots of green stuff in there. And actually, I'm not sure you do if you take a slightly longer view and build it in around a kind of a longer rotation and a longer system.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And speaking of animals and speaking of fungi, I want to be sure to ask you about both growing mushrooms and the silvopasture and agroforestry strategies that might be in use in certain situations and settings. Can you walk us through a bit, maybe starting with the mushrooms and then get into the other?
Yeah, I mean, I do have to sort of issue a slight disclaimer on the mushrooms. I am no mushroom expert. It was something that Chelsea Green and I decided we should cover in the book because it's sort of, they grow so well in woodchips. So, and I have done a little bit, but I definitely would not want to set myself up as any kind of mushroom growing expert. But it's a great medium for growing stuff. I wrote this when my first draft of that chapter. I sent to an associate here who's a commercial mushroom grower, and he said, "Yeah, you might have been a little bit optimistic about some of those methods." So I think the risk, particularly when you're growing it outside, the risk of sort of contamination by different species, the amount of time it takes to manage it. So I had these sort of dreams of being able to, inoculate my wood chip under my trees, and suddenly I've got this free crop of mushrooms that are just going to spring up. And like anything, I think, you've got to know what you're doing and be a bit more focused and really understand it. So, I have grown some nice crops of King Stropharia mainly in wood chip bags, and it's worked quite well. But I think to do it better, you'd need to either sterilize the wood chip or, sort of manage it in a more controlled way, which I don't have the capacity to do where we're working. But I think there's huge potential. And again, looking at some of those single species wood chip, I've definitely got the impression from my research that there's some species that do really well on particular species. I mean, some will only live on one particular species, and some will grow on logs. But by chipping it up, sometimes you can speed up the process. You've effectively kind of half digested their dinner for them. So you can sort of get a crop more quickly. So that's the mushrooms. But the silvopasture is, I mean, that's where a lot of my work at the moment is. Inspired actually partly by Steve Gabriel, another Chelsea Green author who came over and did an event for us. What was that, 4 or 5 years ago? So the farm I work on, the whole farm is actually 1,500 acres, and we've been focusing the planting initially on 200 acres, although we're now expanding a bit. And it's mainly an arable and livestock farm. And the bit where we're doing a lot of the tree planting is heavy clay and not that suitable for cropping, although we do some. And so we're really interested in how we can maximize a range of things actually. So we're looking. So Helen Browning owns the farm business. She's the chief exec of the Soil Association, but she's also a farmer. And her motivations were around climate change resilience. So we've got this wet, heavy clay. It can grow crops, but it's often too wet to get in and cultivate. You get these really short windows in the spring when you can get in and do anything with it. We're too far away from the main dairy building, so we mostly have the young stock there, the young dairy stock. And because it's heavy and wet, we're limited on the amount of time they can spend out there. We're also, Helen's passionate about animal welfare, so in some of the summers we've been having recently, and you see these poor animals out in the field with no shade. So we're looking at how do we create shade, how do we create shelter, how do we dry the soil a bit, how do we lengthen the grazing season. And we know that by reducing reducing wind speed, creating these little microclimates, the grass will grow earlier, it will grow later. So potentially we can extend the grazing season by 2 or 3 weeks at each end. And then, the other big thing is around providing browse for cows, and mostly cows in our instance, but any animal really. And we slipped somehow into kind of cows eat grass, or even worse, eat grain. But actually, a cow can have something like 55% of its diet can come from tree browse. And historically, we've gone, the cows are eating the hedges, quick, get them away from the hedges, rather than going, well, no, let's have more hedges. If they want it that much, it's probably good for them. So we're trying to incorporate as much as we can into the system, mostly for shade, I would say, but also to try and include the browse. There's tree browse has higher micronutrient content than a lot of forage species. It has higher tannin content, so it can reduce internal parasite burdens. There's lots of benefits to having that. And again, one of the myths that I sort of spend a lot of my time trying to bust is this sort of idea that you plant trees and you lose your forage, you lose your grass. A lot of farmers go, I can't plant trees, I won't have any grass for my cows. And obviously you do have a temporary problem in that while the tree's establishing, you've kind of got to keep them away from that tree. But long term, most forage species actually grow better in partial shade than they do in full sun. There's a great study, I can't remember if I quoted it in this book, but it's in, I edited another book called the Agroforestry Handbook, which there's a great study where they looked at something like 45 species of forage, and they grew them at 50% shade, 80% shade, 100% shade, or something like that. Not 100% shade, that would be night. But anyway, different kind of levels of shade. And basically all of them grew better at sort of 40 or 50% shade. And a lot of them grew better even at 80% shade than in full sun. And so having this sort of mix of trees and forage can be really beneficial for everything, not to mention the biodiversity benefit of more trees.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, we out here at Elk Run Farm, there's a whole cluster of farms converting open pasture into silvopasture agroforestry systems, which here in the semi-arid West is also a really important part of the water management strategy. It helps a lot with infiltration and better water retention in the landscape. So it's great to hear about this. And yeah, this agroforestry handbook, I imagine, is a good resource for folks who want to dive deeper into this particular topic.
Yeah, and I mean, it's unfortunately we no longer have any hard copies left, but it is available for download from the Soil Association website if people want to get hold of it.
Okay.
So, yeah.
What's the website, by the way? We may as well include that.
My website or the Soil Association website? Or
the
both?
Soil Association?
Yeah, so I think it's just the soilassociation.com, I guess. I mean, basically Google the Soil Association and it'll come up.
Yeah.
Google Agroforestry Handbook Soil Association. The link will come up. So
excellent. Yeah, and we'll be sure to confirm that and include that in the show notes when we publish the episode. And by the way, on that note, Ben, let me remind our audience, this is the Why on Earth Community Podcast. I'm your host, Aaron William Perry, and today we're visiting with Ben Raskin, the author of the Woodchip Handbook. And you can connect with Ben via Twitter at Ben_Raskin, RASKIN. He administers a Facebook group called Woodchip for Soil Health. You can join that if you're interested. And of course, Ben has his own website, benraskin.uk. There's also a Facebook page called Agroforestry UK you can check out. And on Instagram, it is Ben L. Raskin for his middle initial, Leo. And I want to be sure to reiterate that his book, Woodchip Handbook, is published by Chelsea Green Publishing, one of our partners. If you haven't yet been to the whyonearth.org website, you can check it out and go to the partners and supporters page, and you'll find Chelsea Green there, along with a number of other wonderful companies and organizations we collaborate with. With Chelsea Green in particular, you can use the code YOE35 for a 35% discount on Ben's book and all the other offerings they have at Chelsea Green. And you can get to this via our partners and supporters page, or just go to chelseagreen.com. Want to give a shout out as well to Purium Organic Superfoods. They're offering $50 off of your first order when you connect through whyonearth.org. Earth Hero, safe and sustainable household products and more. Similar discounts and specials there. And then, of course, I mentioned SoilWorks, our in-house social enterprise offering biodynamic soil preparation, special discounts there for you on SoilWorks. And Waylay Waters, our biodynamically and regeneratively grown hemp-infused aromatherapy soaking salts. If you haven't tried Waylay yet for your health and wellness, give it a go. It's a great way to soak and enjoy and relax. And yeah, we're just launching our Simple Gardening Wisdom video course recorded here at Elk Run Farm with Nick DiDomenico on a variety of specific and simple strategies and techniques you can incorporate into your own garden and yard and neighborhood. We're selling that for $33, discounted from $99 right now, the month of May and perhaps beyond May. And a special shout out to our ambassadors who are part of our growing global network and who are in our monthly giving program. If you haven't yet joined the monthly giving program, you can do so clicking on the donate button at whyonearth.org. And if you give at a certain level, we'll be happy to ship you some Waylay Waters soaking salts on a monthly basis as a thank you. And so, yeah, I wanted to mention too, with growing mushrooms, I played around for years, Ben, up at Sustainable Settings, one of the big biodynamic ranches here in Colorado and elsewhere, where I was inoculating wood chips down. I was inoculating around existing clusters of cottonwoods. I even was inoculating some straw bales, and we got little flushes here and there, but I found the best luck I've had, at least in this region, is with the garden giant mushroom. I forget the Latin name, on wood chips around the garden. It seems that one really enjoyed that, and I understand that species of mushroom is a particularly robust soil builder when it has the wood chips to work with. I think that was off of a cottonwood wood chip. I don't know if you see the garden giants out in your area of Western England.
I don't. Without knowing the Latin name, I mean, it sounds quite like the ones that I was growing, but yeah.
Yeah, and by the way, tell us a little about where you're located, right? You were explaining to me before we started recording that you're on the western edge of England, not too far from Wales. Tell us a bit about the landscape there.
Yeah, so I officially live in the West Country, which is sort of the southwest of England, which is where I'm from. I'm originally from a town called Bath, which is relatively famous. So it's got Roman baths there. I now live about sort of about 25 miles from there. So it's the sort of easternmost part of the southwest. So I'm actually sort of quite near the middle of the south of England. But yes, about a mile from Wales, there's a big bridge called the Severn Bridge that you go across the River Severn into Wales. So yeah, it's what's it like? It's rolling countryside. So when you're in Bath, it's kind of quite steep hills like that that I had to walk up to get to school. Where I am now, it's right at the southern end of an area called the Cotswolds, which is sort of very bucolic. You know, if you sort of picture, the English countryside, little kind of chocolate box villages. There's a lot of those about, and the countryside is a bit more. It's sort of rolling. You can see a bit into the distance, but there's some nice hills. Traditionally, sort of sheep land. A lot of arable now, and then so that's where I am.
Sounds lovely. Makes me think about Tolkien's writings.
Yeah. Some of the hills could be a bit like that. Definitely. Yeah.
That's so wonderful. Well, I want to be sure to ask you about another one of my favorite topics, which is hügelkultur. hügelkultur, and I imagine some of our audience is familiar, but probably not everybody. This is another approach to working with the wood in our soil building, our garden, our landscape strategies, right?
Yeah, and I guess the beauty of that is you're not chipping the wood first, mostly. Although you can include, you can include chip wood into the design, but effectively, yeah, you're burying big logs and letting them break down very slowly as a long-term source of organic matter, health, biology, and reserves of water and all the rest of it. So yeah, no, it's a nice way of building resilience, I think, into systems. And I've not done it on any scale. It'd be interesting to see. I think it tends to have been done on a relatively small scale, but it'd be really interesting to see it done, on slightly larger commercial settings, because I'm convinced there's benefits. And again, particularly sort of, you're talking about water retention. If you've got slopes and you can build, it's almost like a kind of dam of these logs that you then cover with compost and soil, and you can imagine them acting as, as the words escape me, when you catch the water coming down the hill. But anyway, yeah.
Like swaling, right? In the
thank you. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's great. And by the way, in the book you mentioned the problem with peat, and peat is something out here in the arid, semi-arid Rocky Mountain West we don't come across very much. Probably the closest is for those who enjoy their peaty scotches after the workday. But you guys out there, right, have peat in the landscape, at least in parts of the UK. And maybe you could explain for our audience, what the kind of traditional historic use of peat has been, and why, that potentially isn't ideal going forward.
So peat effectively is this long-term build-up of moss in effectively very anaerobic condition. It sits often in water most of the year round, and it's an incredible store of carbon. It holds more carbon than grasslands and forests. It's unbelievable amount of carbon. And in Ireland, they cut it and dry it and use it for fuel. Before electricity, that was what heated. A lot of Irish people used it to heat their homes, and so there's still a little bit of it is cut for that. But mostly what it's used for now is for horticultural purposes, for propagation compost, and for growing mushrooms, actually commercially button mushrooms. And it's pretty cheap because all you have to do is dig it up. It's uniform, it's sterile, it's easy to use, and it's pretty predictable as to how it's going to behave. It's not actually the best material in a lot of ways. It's inert, so it hasn't got much biology. It's not always that easy to re-wet when it gets dry, but from it's cheap and easy, and so it's become, certainly in the UK, it's become the default, had become the default material to grow seedlings, and even people at one point, I hope they're still not doing it, but they'd spread it on their soil as a soil improver, which is hopeless for it. Disappears almost instantly. So and as well as that, the habitats where peat grows are often very unique. They're scientifically very diverse and special. So you start digging it all up and you're destroying very sensitive biodiverse landscapes. So there's been a growing movement over, as long as I've been in horticulture, to try and move away from it. And it's been hampered, unfortunately, by commercial interests and by the fear of the unknown. And we're finally getting closer, I think, to a ban here in the UK, certainly for amateur use. The challenge we got at the moment is how you transition. So in one sense, there's no reason why we should be using peat to grow stuff in. We don't, for 99% of stuff, apart from stuff that needs to grow in peat, like plants that come from areas that grow in peat, most of it doesn't need to be. But we've become so dependent on it. There isn't a supply chain around all of the other stuff. So, there's an increasing amount of peat-free material coming onto the market. A lot of it is rubbish. It's really, really bad. And so people buy it thinking they're doing the right thing. And then, it fails and they go, well, I'm not using that again. I'm going to go back to peat that works. So there's a bit of a challenge of sort of how you get away from it. But, one of the things that I discovered with the wood chip, and then we're working particularly with Ian Tolles, was it's really easy to produce your own substrate from wood chip. You just need to let it rot down. It's just time. You leave it long enough and it will turn into a really effective propagation media. And you can stick it in a ton bag in the corner of your garden, and just leave it for 18 months, 2 years, sieve it at the end of it, and put the big lumps back into a new pile, and what you get out you can sow in. Now I haven't tested every single seed, so there might be some vegetables that don't do so well in it, or that this is where this single species could come in, where you might find that, I don't know, hazel works really well for a particular crop and something else works better for another one. But certainly, the trials we did, so we did an innovative farmers field lab, which looked at Tolly's homemade wood chip compost versus the leading commercial peat compost, and there was no difference in germination or performance in the crops. And he basically just stuck wood chip in a pile for 18 months, turned it occasionally and sieved it. So yeah, and it's freely available. It's relatively freely available as a feedstock, which some other things aren't.
It's so interesting. Let me mention too that after our main podcast interview recording, we're going to record a shorter behind the scenes segment that our ambassadors have access to. And if you're not yet an ambassador and you want to get access to these additional resources, you can go to the Become an Ambassador page on the whyonearth.org website. And we'll be exploring some of this a little further, Ben, when we do the behind the scenes segment. And of course, I want to be sure to follow through on our promise about the eureka moment that you mentioned at the beginning of the interview. But before we go there, I'm curious, do you have a favorite species of wood that you work with when you're wood chipping?
That's a good question. You see, mostly I just get what the tree surgeon gives me. So most of my wood chip is just a mix of stuff. Some of it recognizable, some of it not. So I don't know if I do. But I do love hornbeam as a tree. I mentioned hornbeam earlier with this child with the and they've mulched under apple trees with this hornbeam, and it's a lovely dark color, and it held its form more. So I don't know. Yeah, I can't say I've really got afraid. I can't say I've had enough experience of different single species chips. But I'm intrigued by the power of willow, I have to say. It does seem to be this kind of just super life giver. There's something pretty special about willow.
Yeah, I like willow also. Well, what's the big eureka moment that you had?
Yeah, so it came out of an accidental experiment. I love accidental experiments because you find out stuff that you didn't know you were looking for. So we've got an area of the farm where there's a little brook that runs alongside the field, and we've got some big ancient willows that are growing there. And there's historically, a lot of these willows would have been pollarded, and the trees would have been probably fed to the livestock or used for fuel or something like that. But because practices have changed, nobody really pollards commercially or for use anymore. So a lot of these pollards end up getting neglected and grown out. And there's a grant at the moment in the UK which pays farmers to pollard them, so to effectively manage some of these trees, particularly along riverbanks. So we just pollarded around 70 of these really big trees and had a lot of willow chip. And in one section, we just planted a new area. So this was in the sort of autumn, winter 2017, 2018, which in the UK, 2018 was a really hot, dry year. I don't know if it was for you, but and so we threw the chip over the fence with the intention then of me moving the chip and mulching a lot of the trees within the sort of couple of acres of planting that we had. And, you know, as often happens on farms, you know, other things were more of a priority. So I never got back to move the chip. So this one area by the fence had a mulch 2.5 foot deep of willow woodchip, which you might think is probably, you know, almost too much. It's not a depth I would normally recommend. But that year, the trees that, you know, didn't get a mulch barely grew. I mean, actually, we lost probably 50% of the trees that we planted in that year. But this group of trees that got mulched just grew phenomenally. And within 2 years, the trees that hadn't got mulched were barely past my waist. And the ones that had the mulch were 12, 14 feet high. And there's a picture in my book. You can see, and you can't believe they were planted on the same day. And I think, you know, probably in that year, it was around moisture retention. I think, you know, there was just the ones that didn't have the mulch were just too dry, and these ones did. There might have been a temperature thing as well. So, you know, the mulch will keep the soil cooler in the summer and warmer in the winter. And so, you know, with that much mulch, it's possible that the roots were just that much warmer over winter, and so they just did better. But I think that probably a lot of it is around moisture. But that, you know, that was the moment where I realized we had to mulch every tree we planted and mulch it properly. And we've seen, so we planted a couple of hedges last year, which again was not as bad as 2018, but it was hot and dry for us again. You know, we had a period, I think, of about 2 months without rain, which is, you know, for England is pretty unusual. And pretty much every plant in this hedge survived. I think we lost 40 trees over, you know, 400 meters of hedges, because we gave them 25 centimeters, so nearly a foot of mulch. And it's all broken down. It's only that deep now. You know, sort of what is broken down to an inch or something. But, you know, so it's but it just protected it while they established. It kept them cool, it kept them moist. The trees have got away. Once they're established, that's fine. That, you know, you only need to do it once if you do it properly. And that was the other thing for us. We initially go, oh, we'll just put the sprinkling around, but then it disappears and it hasn't done anything. You got to go back the next year and do it again, and that's, you know, more than twice the cost. So we're actually starting to slow down our tree planting a little bit. So rather than go, we've got to plant everything, we've got to plant it now, and, you know, again, no, let's plant. You know, we're almost limiting our planting by how much wood chip we've got to mulch the trees. You go, okay, how many can we manage this year? You know, that's my aim, is to go, right, that's our resource, that's our wood chip. Roughly how many trees is it? Right, we'll plant that many trees and we'll make sure that they're mulched, because we can't irrigate. You know, we don't have, for most of our fields, we can't get water out to them. So we have to plant them well and get them to survive.
Yeah, I imagine this is going to have application out here with a lot of the agroforestry projects around here. And I want to just show our audience who are looking
That's
at the
video,
the photo. It's striking. I mean, in this video, you may not even see on your, I guess it's left, the little trees that didn't do nearly as well.
Yeah, so the ones on the left, you can barely see them, you know, and then the ones on the right, you proper big trees. So,
yeah. Yeah, and there's so many wonderful color photos in the book too. I want to be sure to mention that to our audience, and be sure to encourage folks to get a copy of Ben's book, the Woodchip Handbook. And Ben, wanted to ask you also, can you just tell us a little more about the work you guys are doing at the Soil Association and some of the other organizations that you're connected to and helping to lead?
Yeah, sure. So the Soil Association is, well, I've been there nearly 17 years, which kind of seems almost impossible. I was only supposed to be there for 2 years and I never left. So we're a food and farming charity. Probably the closest you've got is the Rodale Institute, I would guess. But we don't do the research side. There's a separate organic research organisation. We also have a certification business. So we're you know, one of the main certifiers in the UK for organic farms and businesses. I work on the charity side. So I sort of coordinate the horticultural and agroforestry work of the charity. So I think, as you mentioned in the setup, you know, a lot of that is about supporting our growers. It's about, well, the way I sometimes think about it, I mean, separate to the agroforestry bit, is is we have sort of three ways I work with growers and farmers. The ones that are already organically certified, we try and support and help them be even better. The ones that we'd like there to be more organic farms, so we try to encourage people to certify and to be organic. But we also work with a lot of farms that will never be certified and aren't interested in being certified. But we like them to be more organic with a small o, or sustainable or regenerative, or whatever term you want to use. So there's the change in the farming landscape since I started is just, it's astonishing. The 30 years ago when I started, you say you're organic and it's kind of dismissed and you're a bit of a loony, and you're not a proper grower or farmer if you're just going to be a weedy field, and now everybody is on that path, or almost everybody that's at all forward thinking, and it's fantastic. So do like that, and then work with as you mentioned, policy and a lot of communication stuff. So we don't have a particularly supportive government in terms of organic and regenerative farming. Possibly getting a little bit closer, but so that's always a bit of an upward struggle. But the agroforestry bit is just joyful at the moment. Everybody agrees we should be planting more trees, and it's just kind of mainly helping farmers to identify their objectives and give them more information and access to inspiration and case studies and things like that. So and then sorry, you asked about the other organisation as well. I did feel a slight fraud because I'm no longer co-chair of the that group that you mentioned, the DEFRA group. I've stepped down from that, and I've also stepped down from the Organic Growers Alliance board, which I was on for a number of years. But they're a fantastic organisation. Again, a small independent organisation that supports organic growers in the UK. They've got about 400 members, I think. And then the community supported agriculture network is something that I'm still very involved with. And again, I know is sort of there's a lot in the States as well. We're catching up really here. I think we've got around 200 or so community supported agriculture farms, but it's increased massively over the last 2-3 years. And I think as people start to question traditional supply chains, and again here in the UK we've got a very dominant supermarket, multiple retailer sector. They don't tend to treat growers very fairly. They've been underpaying them for a number of years, and some of their supply chains are starting to run into problems, and we've had shortages, and people are going, oh, where am I going to get my food from? I just expected it to be on the supermarket shelf, and what's going to happen now? And again, building those relationships with your grower and having that much closer commitment, I think a lot of people are seeing that as a really positive thing. So
that's wonderful. In my book Why on Earth, I spoke about a three-pronged strategy for our own food resilience, which is show no grow, and it means grow some of your own, however much you can, even if it's just a pot of herbs, whatever, and then know your farmers and sources for food to the extent that you're able, and then show when it comes to sourcing from folks we don't know personally, of course, the third-party certifications around organic, regenerative organic, fair trade, and many of these wonderful practices. It's those third-party certifications that really help us to know and show what's going on. So appreciate that. And since you mentioned Rodale, I have to shout out also to Jeff Moyer and Yichao Rui, 2 different podcast episodes we did with those wonderful guys at Rodale Institute. And I understand neither of them are there any longer. They've both moved on to other things. So it's interesting how fluid some of this can be. And I imagine your retirement from DEFRA and Organic Growers Alliance means that you've left a really good mark and impact at those organizations. And it's so great to hear from you, Ben, and hear your depth of experience and expertise. And I highly encourage folks to get a copy of the Woodchip Handbook from Chelsea Green Publishing. And Ben, before we sign off our recording here, I want to just invite you, if there's anything else you'd like to share with our audience that you haven't had a chance to yet. Of course, we'll do our behind the scenes here in a little bit, but to conclude the podcast, if there's anything else you'd like to share, please, the floor is yours.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, the one thing we've got, I'm organising a massive show, well, massive for me, a massive show in September, the agroforestry show, we're calling it. So we're hoping to get 1,000 people. Now, I realise it's quite a long way to come from the States. But if anyone happens to be in the UK at the beginning of September and wants to come and see the farm, so it's based at the farm where we're planting trees. We're working with the Woodland Trust, which is another great organisation in the UK. And it's going to be pretty exciting. So that's taking up a lot of my headspace and time at the moment is working towards that.
That sounds really exciting. Cool. Yeah, we'll be happy to share that. And with that, Ben, thanks so much for joining me this day for this recording, and it's been a pleasure chatting with you. Really appreciate it. And on behalf of the Y on Earth community, thanks so much for sharing so much with us about wood chipping and beyond.
That's been a real pleasure. Thanks very much for having me on.
See you, Ben.
Bye.
The Y on Earth Community Stewardship and Sustainability podcast series is hosted by Aaron William Perry, author, thought leader, and executive consultant. The podcast and video recordings are made possible by the generous support of people like you. To sign up as a daily, weekly, or monthly supporter, please visit yonearth.org/support. Support packages start at just $1 per month. The podcast series is also sponsored by several corporate and organization sponsors. You can get discounts on their products and services using the code YONEARTH, all one word with a Y. These sponsors are listed on the yonearth.org/support page. If you found this particular podcast episode especially insightful, informative, or inspiring, please pass it on and share it with a friend whom you think will also enjoy it. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for your support. And thank you for being a part of the Y on Earth community.